The dust scattered beneath her boots as Belle Ellington stormed out of her father's general store, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. The whispers of the townsfolk followed her like shadows, too young, too naive, too headstrong, words that clung to her reputation in Silver Creek, Colorado like burrs on a saddle blanket. It was 1876, and at 18, Belle was considered by many to be a child still, despite the responsibilities she shouldered at the store and the grief she'd carried since her mother's passing 3 years prior. "Belle, you get back here this instant." Her father called after her, but his voice was lost to the wind as she rounded the corner and headed toward the livery. She had no destination in mind, just away from the stifling opinions, away from her father's overprotection, away from the town that seemed determined to keep her forever a child. Belle saddled her mare with practiced efficiency, her fingers working through the familiar motions even as her mind raced. "Going somewhere, Miss Ellington?" The deep voice startled her, causing her to drop the stirrup she'd been adjusting. Belle turned to find Yates Xavier leaning against the stable door, his tall frame silhouetted by the afternoon sun. At 25, Yates was everything the women of Silver Creek swooned over: broad shoulders, strong jaw shadowed with stubble, and eyes the color of rain-washed slate. He'd arrived in town 6 months ago, taking over the struggling ranch north of town after his uncle's passing. "That's none of your concern, Mr. Xavier," Belle replied, her voice tight as she turned back to her horse. Yates pushed himself off the doorframe and stepped closer. "Pardon me for saying so, but a young woman riding out alone this close to sundown seems like something that should concern a gentleman." Belle tightened the cinch with more force than necessary. "Perhaps I'm not looking for a gentleman's concern." "Your father's looking for you," Yates said, his voice softening. "Seemed mighty worried. My father thinks I'm still a child who needs protecting from the big, bad world." Belle swung herself into the saddle with practiced ease. "I'm 18 years old, Mr. Xavier. Old enough to know my own mind." Yates stepped forward, placing a hand on her mare's bridle. "But young enough to ride off without telling anyone where you're going? That doesn't seem wise, Miss Ellington." Belle's cheeks flushed with indignation. "Are you suggesting I'm too young to make my own decisions?" "I'm suggesting that wisdom isn't always tied to age," Yates replied, his eyes meeting hers. "And that sometimes running away only proves what others believe about you." His words struck Belle like a physical blow. She sat straighter in the saddle, chin lifted. "I'm not running away, I'm just—" she faltered. "Just what?" Yates prompted. "I'm tired of being told what I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone treats me like I'm too young to understand anything important: business, politics." She hesitated, then added, "Love." Yates' expression softened. "And who's been telling you that?" "Everyone," Belle exclaimed. "My father, Mrs. Holloway at the church, even old Mr. Jenkins at the bank. They all look at me like I'm a child playing at being grown. Today, I overheard Mrs. Peterson telling my father I was too young to know what love really is, that my feelings for." She stopped abruptly, realizing she was revealing too much. "For whom?" Yates asked, curiosity evident in his voice. Belle shook her head. "It doesn't matter. The point is, they think I'm too naive to understand my own heart." Yates was quiet for a moment, considering her words. "Perhaps," he finally said, "you're not too young to know love. Perhaps you're just at the beginning of understanding it." Belle frowned. "What do you mean?" "Love isn't something you instantly know, Miss Ellington. It's something you learn day by day through joy and hardship alike." His hand was still on her horse's bridle, but his eyes never left hers. "If you're too young to know love, as they say, then learn beside someone worth learning with." The sincerity in his voice caught Belle off guard. For the first time since their conversation began, she truly looked at him not as the intimidating rancher who made her stomach flutter when he came to the store, but as a man speaking a truth he seemed to understand deeply. "And how would I know who's worth learning with?" she asked, her voice soft. A small smile played at the corner of Yates' mouth. That, Miss Ellington, is something your heart already knows, even if your mind hasn't caught up yet. Belle's retort was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. Her father appeared at the livery entrance, red-faced and winded. "Belle Ellington, you get down from that horse this instant," Henry Ellington demanded. Yates stepped back, removing his hand from the bridle. "Evening, Mr. Ellington. I was just having a word with your daughter." "This doesn't concern you, Xavier," Henry said gruffly. "Belle home, now." Belle hesitated, looking between her father's stern face and Yates' calm one. With a sigh of resignation, she dismounted. "Yes, father." As she led her mare back to the stall, Yates tipped his hat to her. "Think on what I said, Miss Ellington," he said quietly, then nodded to her father before walking out into the fading daylight. That night, Belle couldn't sleep. Yates' words kept circling in her mind. "If you're too young to know love, then learn beside someone worth learning with." The suggestion made her heart race in a way that confused her. She'd always found Yates' Xavier attractive. What woman in Silver Creek didn't? But she'd never seriously considered him as someone she could learn beside. The next morning, Belle was arranging a display of fabric when the bell above the store door jingled. She looked up to see Yates entering, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. "Good morning, Miss Ellington," he greeted her, his voice carrying across the empty store. Belle smoothed her apron nervously. "Mr. Xavier, what can I help you with today?" "I need some supplies," he replied, approaching the counter. "Flour, coffee, maybe some of those peppermint sticks if you have them." Belle nodded and began gathering his items. "I wanted to apologize for yesterday," she said as she measured coffee beans. "I was upset, and I shouldn't have taken it out on you." "No apology necessary," Yates assured her. "We all have days when the world feels too small for our spirits." The poetic nature of his response surprised her. "That's a nice way of putting it." Yates leaned against the counter, watching her work. "I've been thinking about our conversation," he said after a moment, "about learning love." Belle's hands stilled briefly before resuming their task. "Have you now?" "I have," he confirmed. "And I've been wondering if you might be interested in a proposition." Belle raised an eyebrow, her heart suddenly racing. "What kind of proposition, Mr. Xavier?" "The town's hosting that spring social next Saturday," he said. "I'm not much for dancing, but I thought perhaps you might accompany me. As friends," he added quickly. "A chance to talk more about learning." Belle was acutely aware of the heat rising to her cheeks. "My father wouldn't approve." "I'm not asking your father, Miss Ellington, I'm asking you." Their eyes met across the counter, and Belle felt something shift between them, a recognition, perhaps, of possibilities neither had voiced. "Yes," she said before she could overthink it. "I'd like that." The smile that spread across Yates' face was worth whatever lecture her father might give her later. "Saturday at 6, then. I'll come by your house." As he paid for his supplies and left, Belle couldn't help but wonder what she'd just agreed to. Was this truly just a friendly outing or something more? And if it was more, was she ready for what that might mean? The week passed in a blur of anticipation and anxiety. Belle told her father about the social only 2 days before, causing an argument that ended with her declaration that she was old enough to choose her own company. To her surprise, her father had eventually relented, though not without warning her about that Xavier fellow's reputation. Saturday evening arrived with Belle standing before her mirror, examining her appearance in the blue dress she'd saved for special occasions. Her honey blonde hair was pinned up in a style that had taken her an hour to perfect, with a few curls framing her face. The knock at the front door sent her heart into her throat. She heard her father's gruff greeting, then Yates' deeper response. Taking a deep breath, Belle descended the stairs. Yates stood in the entryway, hat in hand, dressed in a clean black suit that made his shoulders look even broader. When he saw her, his eyes widened slightly, and Belle felt a flutter of satisfaction at having caused such a reaction. "Miss Ellington," he said, his voice tinged with something like reverence. "You look beautiful." "Thank you, Mr. Xavier," she replied, pleased that her voice remained steady despite her nerves. "You clean up rather nicely yourself." Henry Ellington cleared his throat loudly. "Have her home by 10, Xavier, not a minute later." "Yes, sir," Yates agreed, offering his arm to Belle. "Shall we?" The town hall was decorated with spring flowers and lanterns, casting a warm glow over the gathering. As they entered, Belle was acutely aware of the looks they received: curious, surprised, and in some cases disapproving. Mrs. Peterson, who had been the catalyst for Belle's outburst days earlier, whispered something to her husband while staring openly. "People are staring," Belle murmured, suddenly self-conscious. Yates placed his hand over hers where it rested on his arm. "Let them. You have as much right to be here as anyone." His confidence bolstered her own, and Belle lifted her chin, determined to enjoy the evening regardless of wagging tongues. They danced twice. Yates proved to be more capable than he'd admitted and shared punch by the refreshment table. Their conversation flowed easily, moving from books they'd both enjoyed to Yates' plans for his ranch to Belle's dreams of expanding her father's store. "You're quite the businesswoman," Yates commented after Belle explained her idea for adding a millinery section. "Your father's lucky to have you." "If only he'd see it that way," Belle sighed. "He still treats the store as his domain. My ideas are suggestions at best." Yates considered this. "Perhaps he's not ready to see you as the woman you've become. Parents rarely are." "And how do you see me, Mr. Xavier?" Belle asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Yates' gaze became more intense. "I see a young woman with fire in her spirit and wisdom beyond what others give her credit for. I see someone learning her own strength day by day." He paused. "And I see someone I'd like to know better if she'd allow it." Belle's heart hammered in her chest. "I think she might," she replied softly. The moment was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass and raised voices. At the far end of the hall, a confrontation had broken out between two men. Belle recognized one as Tom Decker, a notorious troublemaker who'd been thrown out of her father's store more than once. "We should go," Yates said, placing a protective hand on Belle's back. "This could turn ugly." They weren't fast enough. As they moved toward the exit, Decker shoved his opponent hard, sending him crashing into a table. The table collapsed, spilling punch and food across the floor and sending guests scrambling. In the chaos, Decker drew a pistol. "Everyone stay put," he shouted, his words slurred with drink. Yates pushed Belle behind him instinctively. "Decker, put that away," he called, his voice calm but authoritative. "This isn't worth bloodshed." Decker's bloodshot eyes fixed on Yates. "Well, if it ain't Xavier, thinking he's better than everyone else. Got yourself a pretty little girl too, I see." His gaze shifted to Belle, and the leering smile that spread across his face made her skin crawl. "Leave her out of this," Yates warned, his body tense. "Or what?" Decker sneered, waving the gun unsteadily. "You gonna teach me some manners, rancher?" Sheriff Mills was moving slowly around the edge of the crowd, trying to get a clear approach. Belle saw him signal to Yates, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "I'm not looking for trouble, Decker," Yates said, taking a deliberate step forward, drawing Decker's attention fully to him and away from both Belle and the approaching sheriff. "Too bad trouble found you," Decker snarled, raising his gun. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Yates lunged forward just as Sheriff Mills tackled Decker from behind. The gun discharged, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Women screamed, men shouted, and Belle watched in horror as Yates staggered, clutching his left arm. "Yates!" Belle cried, rushing to his side as he sank to one knee. "I'm all right," he grunted, though the blood seeping between his fingers suggested otherwise. "Just grazed me." Sheriff Mills had Decker face down on the floor, disarmed and in handcuffs. The town doctor, Dr. Harrison, pushed through the crowd to reach Yates. "Let me see that," he ordered, gently moving Yates' hand aside to examine the wound. "You're right, just a graze, but it needs cleaning and stitching. Let's get you to my office." Belle helped Yates to his feet, supporting him though he insisted he could walk on his own. "I'm coming with you," she said firmly when he tried to dissuade her. "Your father," Yates began, "can wait," Belle finished. "You were hurt protecting me. I'm not leaving you." The determination in her voice must have convinced him, for Yates nodded. Together they followed Dr. Harrison out of the hall, leaving behind the chaos and whispers. At the doctor's office, Belle sat beside Yates as Dr. Harrison cleaned and stitched the wound. Yates winced but made no sound, though Belle could see the pain in his eyes. "You were very brave," she said softly as the doctor worked. Yates managed a small smile. "Not particularly, just didn't want to see anyone hurt." "You put yourself between a gun and me," Belle pointed out. "I'd call that brave." When Dr. Harrison finished, he gave Yates instructions for keeping the wound clean and left them alone for a moment while he prepared some pain medicine. "I'm sorry about the social," Yates said, looking genuinely regretful. "Not exactly the evening I promised you." Belle shook her head. "Don't apologize." "If anything, I should thank you." She hesitated, then reached out to take his uninjured hand. "You protected me without a second thought." Yates looked down at their joined hands. "I'd do it again in a heartbeat." The intensity in his eyes made Belle's breath catch. Without thinking, she leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to his. It was brief, barely more than a touch, but when she pulled back, the surprise and wonder in Yates' expression made her heart soar. "Belle," he whispered, her given name on his lips for the first time. The door opened as Dr. Harrison returned, breaking the moment. Belle quickly stood, her face flushed. "I should go find my father," she said. "He'll be worried." "I'll walk you home," Yates offered, starting to rise. "You will not," Dr. Harrison objected. "That arm needs rest." "Miss Ellington, I'm sure Sheriff Mills would be happy to escort you home once he's dealt with Decker." Reluctantly, Belle agreed, though not before promising Yates she would check on him the next day. As she left with the sheriff 20 minutes later, the memory of that brief kiss burned bright in her mind, along with the way Yates had said her name like a prayer, a promise. Word of the incident at the social spread through Silver Creek like wildfire. By Sunday morning, everyone knew how Yates Xavier had protected Belle Ellington from Tom Decker's drunken rampage. The story grew with each telling, until by church time, Yates had supposedly wrestled the gun from Decker's hand while bleeding profusely from his wound. Belle endured the stares and whispers at church with as much dignity as she could muster. Her father, surprisingly, had not been as angry as she'd expected when she arrived home with Sheriff Mills the night before. If anything, he seemed thoughtful, asking pointed questions about Yates' actions during the confrontation. After church, Belle changed into a simpler dress and informed her father she was going to check on Mr. Xavier. "I'll come with you," Henry said, surprising her. They rode to Yates' ranch in silence, the spring air warm around them. The ranch was modest but well-maintained, with a small herd of cattle grazing in the distance and several horses in the corral near the barn. Yates answered their knock promptly, his left arm in a sling but otherwise appearing well. His eyebrows rose slightly at the sight of both Ellingtons on his porch. "Miss Ellington, Mr. Ellington," he greeted them. "This is unexpected. Please come in." The interior of Yates' home was simple but comfortable, a far cry from the bachelor quarters Belle had imagined. Books lined a small shelf, a quilt that looked handmade draped over a chair, and everything was tidy and well-ordered. "How's the arm?" Henry asked gruffly as they sat in Yates' small living area. "Healing well, sir," Yates replied. "Dr. Harrison says I was fortunate." Henry nodded, then cleared his throat. "I wanted to thank you personally for protecting my daughter last night. Sheriff Mills told me what happened." Yates glanced at Belle, then back to her father. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Henry said firmly. "They wouldn't have. Most men would have looked to their own safety first." He paused. "It seems I may have misjudged you, Xavier." The admission clearly surprised both Yates and Belle. Henry Ellington was not known for changing his mind about people easily. "I appreciate that, sir," Yates said sincerely. Henry stood abruptly. "I've got some business in town. Belle, I'll meet you at the general store in 2 hours." He fixed Yates with a stern look. "You'll see she gets there safely." "Yes, sir," Yates promised. After Henry left, Belle turned to Yates with wide eyes. I can't believe he did that. Yates smiled. Your father loves you. He wants what's best for you even if he doesn't always show it the right way. And what about you? Belle asked softly. What do you want? Yates' expression grew serious. I think you know, Belle, but I don't want to rush you. You're right that you're old enough to know your own mind, but this is still new between us. Belle moved to sit beside him on the small sofa. About last night. The kiss. She began, her cheeks warming at the memory. I've been thinking about nothing else, Yates admitted, his voice low. Neither have I, Belle confessed, and I don't regret it. Yates reached out with his good hand to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. You're remarkable, Belle Ellington. This time when they kissed, it was no brief touch. Yates' lips were warm and gentle against hers, his hand cradling her face as if she were something precious. Belle felt as though her heart might burst from the tenderness of it. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Yates pressed his forehead to hers. Is this what learning love feels like? Belle whispered. Yates smiled. I think it might be, for both of us. The weeks that followed were filled with moments Belle knew she would treasure forever. Yates courted her properly with her father's grudging blessing. They rode across his land, had picnics by the creek that bordered his property, and spent evenings on her father's porch, talking until the stars filled the sky. With each day, Belle felt herself growing more sure of her feelings and of Yates. This wasn't the fleeting infatuation Mrs. Peterson had accused her of being too young to understand. This was something deeper, something that bloomed slowly but with undeniable strength. It wasn't without challenges. Some in town still whispered that Belle was too young for a man like Yates, that she didn't know what she was getting into. Yates' arm healed, but the incident at the social had stirred up rumors about his past, rumors that he'd been involved in gunfights before, that he'd left his previous home under mysterious circumstances. One evening in late May, as they walked along the creek, Belle finally asked about the whispers. People say you had to leave Missouri because of trouble. Is that true? Yates was quiet for a long moment and Belle feared she'd overstepped. Finally, he nodded. Yes, in a way, I was a deputy there in a small town not unlike this one. There was a land dispute that turned violent. A man was killed not by my hand, but I was there and some blamed me for not stopping it. He looked at her, his expression open and vulnerable. I didn't run because I was guilty. I ran because I couldn't bear the way people looked at me after, like I'd failed them. Belle took his hand in hers. Thank you for telling me the truth. I'll always tell you the truth, Belle, he promised. Even when it's difficult. That's part of learning love too, honesty, even when it's easier to hide. As spring turned to summer, Belle found herself taking on more responsibility at the store. To her surprise, her father began to implement some of her ideas, even giving her control over ordering for the new millinery section she'd proposed. When she thanked him, he gruffly admitted that Yates had made him see she wasn't a child anymore. He stood up for you, Henry explained. Came to me man to man and told me I was doing you a disservice by not recognizing your capabilities. He shook his head. Took guts, that. Belle was touched that Yates had advocated for her, but also amused that it had taken another man's word to convince her father of what she'd been saying for years. In July, during the town's Independence Day celebration, Yates asked Belle to take a walk with him, away from the crowds and fireworks. They ended up at the spot where they'd had their first picnic, now lush with summer wildflowers. I've been thinking, Yates said as they sat on a blanket he'd brought, about what you said that first day about being too young to know love. Belle smiled at the memory. I was angry. You were right to be, Yates replied. But I've been wondering if I was right too about learning love beside someone. He took her hands in his. These past months with you, Belle, I've learned more about love than I ever thought possible. I've learned it's patient and kind, that it means wanting the best for someone even when it's hard, that it grows stronger through honesty and shared dreams. Belle's heart began to race as Yates reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. I know people will still say you're too young, he continued, opening the box to reveal a delicate gold ring with a small pearl. But I don't care what they say. I care what you say, what you feel. He took a deep breath. Belle Ellington, will you marry me? Will you continue learning love beside me for the rest of our days? Tears filled Belle's eyes as joy bubbled up within her. Yes, she whispered, then louder. Yes, Yates Xavier, I will marry you. As he slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his arms, Belle knew that whatever others might say about her age or her readiness for marriage, this was right. This was where she belonged, learning love beside the man who had seen her strength when others saw only youth, who had valued her mind when others dismissed her ideas, who had protected her heart while encouraging it to grow. Their wedding took place in October, when the aspen trees turned gold and the mountains wore their first dusting of snow. Belle wore her mother's dress, altered by her own hands with wildflowers in her hair. Yates stood tall and proud in a new suit, his eyes never leaving Belle as she walked toward him on her father's arm. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, attended by most of the town, even Mrs. Peterson, who had grudgingly admitted that perhaps Belle had known her own heart after all. As they spoke their vows, Belle thought of how far they'd come since that day in the livery when Yates had suggested she learn love beside someone worthy. She had found that someone, and the learning had only just begun. Their first year of marriage brought changes neither could have anticipated. Belle continued working at her father's store while helping Yates expand his ranching operation. They added rooms to his house, making it truly their home. When Henry Ellington suffered a mild heart attack in the spring, Belle took over running the store entirely while he recovered, proving once and for all that she was more than capable of managing a business. On their first anniversary, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of pink and gold, Belle shared news that filled both their hearts with joy. They were expecting a child in the spring. Yates pulled her close, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice tender. Belle looked up at the man who had taught her that love wasn't something to be instantly known but continually learned day by day through challenges and joys alike. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," she answered truthfully. "And to think," Yates said with a smile, "they said you were too young to know love." Belle laughed, the sound carrying across the land they'd built together. "Perhaps I was," she admitted, "but I wasn't too young to learn." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Belle leaned her head against her husband's shoulder, grateful for the journey that had brought them here, a journey that had begun with anger and tears, but had led to a love deeper and truer than either of them could have imagined. A love they would continue learning together for all the days to come.